another deep dive. This time we're going to be taking a look at this recent agreement. You probably saw it in the headlines. This 100-year partnership between the UK and Ukraine. Now, 100 years, obviously. That's a long time. That sounds really serious. But we're going to be doing our deep dive based on an opinion piece we found in Al Jazeera.
Okay.
Written by a former British diplomat named Ian Proud. And Mr. Proud, he's got a ton of experience in the Legion with both Russia and Ukraine. And his take is that this might be more political theater than an actual turning point in the relationship. So let's see what he has to say. Let's see what he's highlighting.
Yeah. I think the interesting thing here is the contrast between, the really grand announcement of this partnership and then what it actually contains. So back on January 16th of this year, 2025, we saw Prime Minister Starmer over in Kyiv with President Zelensky. They announced this partnership.
Yeah.
It includes things like a strategic dialogue. It's going to be £3 billion in yearly military aid to Ukraine, a £2.2 billion loan, and even £40 million to help support businesses in Ukraine. So, on the surface, it sounds pretty impressive.
Yeah, it does sound like a lot, but I have a feeling there's a but coming here.
There is a but. A lot of these things were actually already in motion. A lot of this was based on a treaty signed back in 2020. Between the two countries. And the military funding has been flowing for a while now since the war began. The loan was part of a decision made by the G7 back in June of last year. So really the only new money here is that relatively small amount for supporting businesses.
So it's kind of like they're taking things that they were already doing.
Yeah.
And just sort of repackaging it with a new label, this 100-year partnership.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder about the point of these agreements, if they're more symbolic than substantial.
Yeah. What legal weight do they really carry?
Yeah.
Especially over such a long period of time. I mean, Proud points out in the article that the UK has entered into over 15,000 treaties since 1892. So if they're signing that many, can any single one really matter?
That's a good point. It's almost like those times when someone says they're going to help you move and then they forget.
Yeah.
It's like, well,
No.
Was that really a promise or was that just
Just words.
Yeah, just words. So if it's mostly symbolic, why announce it now? What's the political backdrop for all of this?
Well, the timing, I think, is really key. We have a newly inaugurated President Trump here in the U.S., and he's already pledged to end the war in Ukraine within his first 100 days in office. So this could really signal a potential shift in the West's support for Ukraine.
But we've seen some evidence of that already, haven't we?
Yeah, Germany. They were the second largest donor to Ukraine, and they've already cut their support in half. And if President Trump follows through with his pledge, the U.S. could drastically reduce its aid as well, which, by the way, currently stands at about $175 billion since the war began back in 2022.
Wow. That's a lot of money. So is the UK trying to fill a void here that might be left by others? Or is there something else going on? And more importantly, can they even afford this? Because things aren't exactly great in the UK economically.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Proud highlights some of the struggles that the UK is facing right now. Their national debt exceeds 100% of their GDP. Interest rates are going through the roof, and the Labour government's facing a lot of pressure to make cuts to public spending, potentially even to things like disability benefits. So if they're struggling to manage their own finances, how realistic is it for them to provide this kind of long-term support to Ukraine?
Yeah, that's a major dilemma. On the one hand, they want to show that they're standing with Ukraine. But on the other hand, they have this economic reality that might make that very difficult.
Exactly. And that leads to another layer of complexity here that Proud brings up, which is the potential impact of a ceasefire.
Oh, right. Because that changes the whole picture, doesn't it?
It does. Ukraine's military spending right now is enormous. It's about 50% of all their government spending. And it's actually about a quarter of their entire GDP.
Yeah.
So if there is a ceasefire, that would likely lead to a pretty significant reduction in the amount of money they need from foreign aid.
So for the UK, a ceasefire would almost be like a get-out-of-jail-free card.
It's possible. It would give them a very justifiable reason to start scaling back on some of their financial commitments. And we also have to keep in mind that there's no guarantee the future UK governments will necessarily feel bound by this agreement.
That's a little bit concerning. I mean, it really adds to the uncertainty of this whole partnership.
And when you factor in the UK's own economic troubles, it makes you wonder if this partnership will even last 100 years. Or even a fraction of that.
Yeah. It's almost like they're making this grand gesture, but not really thinking through the long-term implications of it. Is that what Proud is getting at here?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. I mean, he really dives into some of the specifics here, reminding us about those figures, the £3 billion in yearly military aid. that £2.2 billion loan. But like we were just discussing, a lot of that was already on the table anyway.
Right. He talked about that 2020 treaty between the two countries as laying a lot of this groundwork.
Exactly. That treaty, all 568 pages of it. It covered a wide range of areas, from political cooperation to free trade to this strategic partnership. And much of what they're calling this new partnership is really just a rehashing of commitments that were already made in that 2020 agreement.
So even the strategic dialogue that they announced.
Even that was already a part of the 2020 treaty. And as we mentioned, the military funding and the loan were already a done deal. If this were truly a groundbreaking new commitment, wouldn't we expect to see some new initiatives, new funding streams?
Yeah. It makes you wonder if this is more about optics and PR than an actual policy shift.
It's a very valid interpretation. And it wouldn't be the first time that we've seen this sort of symbolic diplomacy. Think back to that cultural agreement between the UK and Indonesia you mentioned earlier.
Oh, yeah. The one where the Foreign Office basically admitted that they thought it was meaningless, but they went along with it because it was important to the Indonesians.
Right. Sometimes these agreements are more about optics and managing relationships than they are about taking concrete actions.
So, looking ahead, what does this all mean for the UK's relationship with Ukraine?
Well, that's where it gets even more complicated. On the one hand, the UK government does seem genuinely committed to supporting Ukraine. They've got pretty strong cross-party support in Parliament, and for the most part, the media has shielded both the Conservative and Labour governments from criticism about their spending on Ukraine. But as we've been talking about, this could easily change.
Especially with the potential for a ceasefire. Yes, exactly. If Trump is successful in brokering a ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia, the pressure on the UK to keep up this level of support is probably going to decrease. And remember, a ceasefire would likely reduce Ukraine's military spending, which would in turn decrease their need for so much foreign aid.
So almost like a get-out-of-jail-free card.
In a sense, yes. It would give them a plausible reason to scale things back a bit. And of course, there's no guarantee that future UK governments will even feel bound by this agreement anyway.
So we're back to that question of whether this 100-year partnership will actually last 100 years, or even a fraction of that.
Right. And when you add in the UK's own economic problems, it gets even harder to imagine. It's almost like they're making this grand gesture without thinking through all of the consequences.
That's a really good point. It really shows how important it is to look beyond just the initial fanfare and really dig into the details.
Absolutely. International relations are rarely as straightforward as they seem. There are always these underlying currents, competing interests, things that you don't necessarily see right away. So, for our listeners out there, what should they be paying attention to as this all unfolds? What are some key things to watch for?
Well, first and foremost, I'd keep an eye on what happens in Ukraine. If Trump does manage to broker that ceasefire, that's going to significantly impact the UK's commitment to this partnership.
Makes sense. What else?
I would also pay close attention to the UK's own economic situation. If their financial troubles continue, maintaining this level of support for Ukraine is going to be extremely challenging, no matter what agreements they've made.
So it's all about watching for those real-world factors that could potentially undermine even the most well-intentioned diplomatic efforts.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that international agreements like this aren't set in stone. They're fluid, and they're subject to change based on all sorts of factors.
This has been a really insightful discussion. I think I've learned a lot. So for our listeners, where do we go from here?
Well, I think the key takeaway is that it's so important to look beyond the headlines and to really think critically about the context, the motivations, and all the potential obstacles that surround any agreement or political promise.
Definitely. Things are rarely as simple as they seem. And it's so crucial to really dig deeper and analyze the information that we're given.
This whole deep dive has really shown how important it is to be skeptical, you know? It's really easy to get caught up in the excitement of a big announcement like this 100-year partnership. But as we've seen, the reality is often much more complicated.
Yeah. We need to look beyond the surface. We have to. Dig into the details. Consider all the different factors involved, whether it's an international agreement, a political promise, even just a personal commitment, understanding the context, understanding the motivations, and thinking about the potential roadblocks is absolutely crucial.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And it's interesting to apply that thinking to this situation we've talked about. The political forces at play, the economic forces at play, that could shape the future of this partnership. But
there's another element, I think, that we haven't really touched on yet. which is the human element.
Oh, that's interesting. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, think about the people. The people of Ukraine and the people of the UK. How are their perceptions and expectations going to influence this relationship over the course of the next century? I mean, their opinions, their hopes, their fears, all of these things are going to play a role in how this partnership actually unfolds.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for being here, everyone. We'll be back soon to explore more of the topics that matter.
Until then, stay curious.
Stay informed and stay engaged.